The following program is produced by the University of Florida's School of Journalism and Communications under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center in cooperation with the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. The University of Florida presents The Revolution of Rising Expectations, the first in a weekly series of recorded documentary reports on the contemporary revolution in Latin America. Your reporter is the distinguished American journalist and editor of the Christian Science Monitor, Erwin D. Canham.
The singing you hear is of school children in a small village not far from Guatemala City. They are but one segment of the voice of Latin America, and they sing unmindful of grim possibilities. Yet, if the relentless course of present events is not altered, the overwhelming majority of these children in this first-grade class will never finish primary school at all, and very few of them will survive beyond his 44th year. But the people of Latin America are determined to change this relentless course of events, determined to seek out a better way of life for themselves and their children. That is what this series is about. It will examine the nature of the contemporary revolution in Latin America. By now we can begin to see the highly interrelated nature of the problems facing most of Latin America. Perhaps no problem is more interrelated than that of economic development. To University of Florida political scientist Harry Cantor, teaching on a leave of absence in Costa Rica, the problem is circular.
It is a sort of vicious circle. Latin America is not economically developed enough to provide a decent standard of living for its people. And it cannot provide a decent standard of living for its people because these people are sick, uneducated, with very little energy, and they cannot themselves build up the enterprises which are needed to provide the kind of living that they need.
The attitude of the Latin American people on the eve of our 1960 presidential elections is reflected by a student from Peru who was attending the University of Florida at the time.
Well, Latin America basically it needs a new deal. Latin America has heard throughout all these years, as the rest of the world has too, we have heard the advertising made by this country, that here there is freedom, there is personal liberties, that here there is democracy, there is free enterprise. People believe that, and they prefer to use that in order to achieve this political stability, the social justice, the economic progress that they all want and we don't yet have. Well, I think that this period of advertising is over. Now it's the time for action, and Latin America is waiting for it.
During the election campaign, then Senator John Kennedy had pledged a new Latin American policy. On March 13, 1961, he unveiled his program to the Latin American Diplomatic Corps stationed in Washington.
Therefore, I have called on all people of the hemisphere to join in a new alliance for progress, Alianza para Progreso, a vast cooperative effort to satisfy the basic needs of the American people for homes, work, and land, health, and schools, techo, trabajo, y tierra, salud y escuela. First, I propose that the American republics began on a vast new 10-year plan for the Americas, a plan to transform the 1960s, and if we are successful, every American republic will be the master of its own revolution and its own hope and progress.
Is Kennedy's Alliance for Progress coming in time? And is it enough to stem the tide? Earlier in the year, before the Kennedy pronouncement, Jose Figueres was pessimistic. He told a University of Florida audience,
I believe that unless a great effort comes under the leadership of the United States to develop Latin America rapidly along the democratic lines, unless this comes, we are going to lose the Cold War in Latin America. If someone had told me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that Latin America could align itself with Russia and China in a Cold War, I would have thought it was preposterous. And yet it is happening.
To conclude our program, we have invited members of the graduate faculty of the University of Florida School of Inter-American Studies to summarize what we have heard so far, and if they will, to try to come to some definite conclusions about the revolution of rising expectations. Here to introduce the panel is the school's director, Dr. A. Curtis Wilgus.
Thank you, Mr. Canham. Everyone who has an interest in Latin America should keep in mind that these countries have changed a great deal in the past century, indeed in the last 135 years since independence. Many of the problems of today have been inherited from the past. Historically speaking, some of these problems go back to the 16th century. Over the years, the people of Latin America have been concerned largely in trying to stay alive, but frequently the national economy has failed them, with unfortunate national and international consequences. Joining me today are Robert W. Bradbury, Professor of Latin American Economics, and Lowry Nelson, Visiting Professor of Latin American Sociology. Dr. Bradbury, as an economist, what do you think about these economic problems?
Latin America, and again, of course, this is a matter of realizing that there are 20 countries involved here, so that the rates are different. But Latin America as a whole is the fastest growing region of the world. As an economist, I would say that Latin America wants to increase its standard of living. Its standard of living goes up if its production increases more rapidly than its population. It goes down if its production increases less rapidly than the increase in population. With this great increase, this very rapid increase, we're a little bit in the way of Alice in Wonderland. You have to run faster in order to stay at the same place. This then has given rise to the great movements throughout Latin America, looking toward increased production. Dr. Nelson, as a sociologist, what do you think is the most important problem in Latin America?
Well, one of the very important ones is part of this heritage from the earlier period. I refer to the dual class system in which there was an elite few and a great mass of the lower class. Often in these countries it is related also to the racial composition. The native population usually is on a lower plane, part of the lower class. The elite is almost always the group that descend directly from Spanish blood or Portuguese, as the case may be. This dual class system in which the one governs and the other works makes it rather difficult, has made it always very difficult to bring about needed reforms. So much responsibility rests upon the elite, who are reluctant to make any concessions until they are forced to do so. So the class system, it seems to me, is one of the big impediments to bringing about social evolution. But now the thing is becoming urgent.
Yes, absolutely. The countries of Latin America are looking at both the United States and Russia as examples of economies that have developed through industrialization. And they're going to follow one or the other. It's a question which one is most attractive as a means of improvement. And so we are facing a conflict of ideology throughout Latin America.
Thank you, gentlemen. For the past half hour, we've been reporting on the revolution of rising expectations, a part of the contemporary revolution in Latin America.
Revolution of Rising Expectations is the first in a series of weekly documentary reports on the contemporary revolution in Latin America. The program was narrated by the distinguished American journalist and editor of the Christian Science Monitor, Erwin T. Canham. The series is produced in cooperation with the University of Florida School of Inter-American Studies. You may receive without charge the text of today's program by writing this station. This program was prepared and recorded by Will Lewis for Radio Center, School of Journalism and Communications, University of Florida, Gainesville, under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center, and is being distributed by the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. This is the NAEB Radio Network.
We asked Dr. Raymond Christ, the research professor of geography at the University of Florida, to brief us on the historical and geographical background of land tenure in Latin America.
The Spaniards, when they came, found Indo or Indian civilizations that had already evolved their land tenure systems, and those were based around village holdings. The Spaniards themselves, in many cases, swept these aside or superimposed on these groups from in the higher mountain areas between Mexico and northern Argentina their own manorial or feudal systems of great landed estates. These have, in the course of time, exerted a kind of dead hand influence on the economies of these countries in many instances. Furthermore, in relatively recent times, there has been a development of the plantation economy. In both cases, the systems of the plantation system and the hacienda system have been superimposed or pushed aside the original Indians and their holdings. This has brought about, in so many instances, cases in which the rights of property have been so far extended that millions of people have been without land, without enough to live on, and with the result that, in the course of time, they have demanded what they think is an inalienable right, namely the right to land which they can cultivate and get the food they want to eat.
Florida's junior senator, George Smathers, disagrees with Dr. Teichert. The senator has always had a keen interest in Latin America, has traveled extensively, particularly in the countries of Central America and the Caribbean. Here's what he has to say in response to the view that revolution is necessary to bring about agrarian reform.
I would say that the Fidel Castro revolution and the communist takeover there in Cuba has alerted and aroused and awakened most people of Latin America to the need, that is the so-called privileged class, who we all agree up to this point have not done enough for their own countries. They've taken a lot out of it and given very little back. I think they are now awakening to the fact that unless they themselves initiate certain governmental reforms, unless they themselves start paying taxes and contributing to the upgrading of their schools, their hospitals, their roads, that then, if they do not do something of this character, they're then going to be thrown out and not only lose their lives and their fortunes, but their country as well.
So far in this program, we have used the terms land reform and agrarian reform interchangeably. Is there a difference in meaning between them? We asked a research sociologist at the University of Florida, T. Lynn Smith, this question.
Yes, I myself very definitely prefer the term agrarian reform, because whatever measures or endeavors we make along these lines, we are dealing with the relationship of man to land. And in this relationship, man is the is the active element and land is the passive element. For this reason, I prefer to refer to it as agrarian reform, to stress the human element rather than land reform, which stresses the passive element.
Well, under this definition, what is the ultimate objective of agrarian reform?
Well, always when I'm in Latin America, and this now for decades that I have been working in and with Latin American governments, I have always accepted and followed a statement which was made one time by the Brazilian Commission on Agrarian Policy, which indicated the fundamental objective of agrarian reform was the valorization of the ordinary rural man in Brazil, meaning to develop the human qualities of the ordinary citizen, rural citizen, to the maximum. This is the fundamental objective of agrarian reform.
Dr. T. Lynn Smith explains the appeal of the demagogue to the landless masses in Latin America.
The demagogue ordinarily is inclined to point to the fact that there are rich, productive lands, frequently large amounts of them in the hands of a few proprietors, and very large numbers of workers and frequently voters, with little or nothing in the way of landed property which he can use, either saying or insinuating that you, the voter, ought to have a part of this other man's estate. As a matter of fact, a great many people, this is about the only idea they have of the meaning of agrarian reform, is simply to seize the acreages held in large estates and to divide them among the workers.
Responsible Latin American leaders are worried about what may happen if agrarian reform laws are not passed and put into operation soon. In Bogota, Dr. Orlando Falsborda wondered aloud what might take place if the land reform law, which was then before Congress, failed to pass.
I think it would be a very unfortunate situation because most farmers and most Colombians have high expectations about the passing of this law. It would be a definite outcome that a social revolution could happen, perhaps worse.
On the campus of the University of Florida, the debate goes on over land reform. Which way? Evolution or revolution? With students from 18 Latin American countries in attendance, it's not unusual to hear very frank discussions on this subject. We listened in on a bull session with 4 Latin American students.
Well, the point under issue now seems to be whether it is convenient to go into a radical, fast land reform in Latin American countries or go at a low rate of speed. How long have we have to wait to see some changes crystallize, and if they're going to be effective as a whole?
It will be effective. All depends the government and the people and the education too.
That's an important point, the education. And you can't educate a man in a period of 6 or 7 months. You can't change his whole way of looking at the earth and try and change his psychological relationship between his relationship to the government and his relationship as a free landowner and his relationship to the landlord.
Yeah, but there is only one way of learning how to play piano. Start playing it.
Yeah, you have to do it, but you're...
but not a radical way.
You can't do it the radical way, and I think that's proved in Guatemala very, very effectively.
To conclude our program, we have invited members of the graduate faculty of the University of Florida's School of Inter-American Studies to summarize what we have heard so far, and if they will, try to come to some definite conclusions about the agrarian revolution. The panelists are Dr. Robert W. Bradbury, Professor of Economics, Dr. Raymond E. Christ, Research Professor of Geography, whom we've heard earlier in the program, and A.S. Muller, Professor in the College of Agriculture.
Land reform is needed in Latin America because today we need more agricultural production. And the system of land use in Latin America in the past will not satisfy the need of today, because the hacienda system lived, you might say, for itself. It produced what was needed on that large estate for the people who lived there, but it did not produce food to be used in the cities which are developing at such a fast rate, and you cannot have large populations in cities unless you have large amounts of food to feed them.
There's one thing that is hopeful in Latin America, and that is that under our point 4, we have been giving technical assistance to try to develop a more modern, market-oriented agriculture. This is very important because we know that since 1945, in other words, in the last 15 years, in a good many countries, the population has grown more rapidly than agricultural production. In other words, the agricultural production per capita is less today than it was in 1945. And yet, if we can train these, the Latin Americans in better methods of agriculture, evolution may bring about a reform rather than revolution.
One of the important things I can't help thinking in this connection, that one of the important activities that should be carried out all over Latin America is a land survey. There should be a land survey instituted so that people, the country itself, knew how much land, how much national land it had, so that people could figure out how much land the large landlords have. I might say that in many countries this survey has been opposed because the landlords, who themselves have been the government to a large extent, are not interested in having it known how much land they have.
I think one of the reforms that is taking place, but taking place very, very slowly, is an imposition of land taxes. Historically, the land in Latin America has been taxed at a very, very low rate. And this has made it possible to do, as you say, of producing only on 1/3 or 1/4 of your land holding. The imposition of heavier land taxes would force more of this idle land into productive use.
Precisely. But if those who own the land are the ones in the government, they are not going to get too energetic about imposing taxes on their own property. That's one of the difficulties.
Yes, it is, and that is, of course, one of the hopeful signs of the emergence of a middle class, because when the middle class gets political power, it is apt to bring about this reform in a peaceful manner through taxation, rather than the violent overthrow of the whole system by the lower class, the peasants, demanding a breakup of the large estates.
Yes, and who have nothing to lose and everything to gain.
And speaking of the peasants, we mustn't forget the aspirations of these millions of them that want to feel that they own something. And land is something which is valuable. Money isn't so important to them. But if they can say, this land is mine, they are a much happier man.
Thank you, gentlemen. For the past half hour, we've been reporting on the Agrarian Revolution, a part of the contemporary revolution in Latin America.
The struggle for democracy in Latin America is very complicated by the fact that Latin America, as a whole, has never gotten over the inheritance of the colonial period in its history.
Harry Cantor is a political scientist at the University of Florida who taught the past academic year in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Unfortunately for Latin America, when the Spaniards came to the area, they overcame the military opposition of the Indians and set up a society in which a small group of basically Spaniards ruled a vast mass of Indians. through the generations and the centuries which have passed since then, this idea that a small group, an aristocracy, is entitled to dominate the political, social, economic, religious life of the people has so permeated certain sections of society that democracy has had a very, very hard struggle to become established.
Well, first thing, I don't think that this government is in any position to be criticized because we have not broken off relationships with some of these dictatorships.
Florida's junior senator, George Smathers.
I think it's unrealistic, dreamy, visionary, and completely impractical for a lot of people, dreamy people, who get the idea that you can have the kind of a democracy in Haiti that we have in Florida. When you stop to remember that the per capita income in Haiti today is less than $47 per year per person, the illiteracy rate is 87% of the people. Now, Duvalier does not run a dictatorship, but you have to have a strong man, because you just cannot operate a government on a democratic basis unless you have a high level of education. So I think it's a matter of being realistic. What are the facts? And the facts are that they're making progress in Nicaragua. The facts are that Stroessner in Paraguay, I presume, is making progress there. I've never been to that country. I don't know him, but I hear that most of his people are direct Indian descent, that they are uneducated, that they have not had any opportunity, and he's trying to bring about a slowly developing economy for them and give them more opportunities than they have previously had.
This is Jules Dubois, Latin American correspondent of the Chicago Tribune. Well, Senator Smathers has a right to his opinion, no matter how erroneous it may be. I do not agree with him that Stroessner, for example, is a necessary evil because of illiteracy in Paraguay. Senator Smathers probably overlooks the fact that there are 400,000 Paraguayans in exile across the river in Argentina, and a large number of them in Buenos Aires, and they surely are not illiterates. The same holds true in other places. Haiti, for example, Duvalier is not a necessary evil because of the illiteracy of the Haitian people. The Haitian people have lived good lives, better lives, under better governments.
A student of the Liberal Party movement in Latin America, Dr. Harry Cantor, believes the popular democratic parties are stealing the communists' thunder.
One thing about the communist movement is agreed to by everybody who has studied it, and that is that the communist movement has spent a tremendous amount of money in Latin America. For this, they have gotten very little results. The reason that the Communist Party has not had too much success is because in most of the countries of Latin America, indigenous reformist movements have sprung up, which have managed to win the support of the majority of the population. Now, the Communist Party, whose slogan is that it has a monopoly on reform, never admits that any other reformist movement can be on the right track. And therefore, in those countries where these strong reformist movements have sprung up, the communists have allied themselves with the most conservative and reactionary forces in society in an attempt to gain a foothold amongst the masses. Acción Democrática of Venezuela, the National Liberation Party of Costa Rica, the Prista movement of Peru. These groups have tried to combine the ideas of European democratic socialism with ideas about what America or Latin America needs to create something new in political ideology. And with the years, they have seemed to grow stronger and stronger in all Latin America.
One of the bright spots in the struggle for democracy in Latin America is located some 15 kilometers outside of San Jose, Costa Rica. There, in a building formerly occupied by a nightclub and restaurant, is what has come to be known as a school for democracy.
The liberal parties of Latin America, with some U.S. friends, have founded in Costa Rica a school for training young political leaders and young labor leaders on the democratic camp. This is a belated effort, but very much needed.
One of the school's founders, Jose Figueres.
We expect to have 3 groups of 50 boys from all countries living together for 90 days on their intensive course on democracy, on history, on economics, on political organization, and on the democratic labor movement. We hope to enlarge this school. As we get more funds, we will enlarge the groups. These boys from many countries will become an international fraternity of democracy. The fact that they're living together, working together during 90 days under good, sound teachers seems to start a very interesting and vigorous movement for the future. I'm sorry we began so late, but at least we have already started. The first course is already working.
When the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1823, there was comment all over the Western Hemisphere, as well as all over the world, of course, about what our objectives were. And it didn't take the Latin Americans long to realize that we were trying to do something that they didn't quite understand, and it made them suspicious of us immediately, and the Monroe Doctrine has tended to make them continue in their suspicion of us over the years.
Director of the University of Florida School of Inter-American Studies, Dr. A. Curtis Wilgus, discussed the early effects of the Monroe Doctrine with a faculty member.
I think, Dr. Worcester, you, as professor of history, have a number of comments to make on this early period in the 19th century, because it was such a critical period.
Well, Dr. Wilgus, I think in part the initial reaction against the Monroe Doctrine was based upon disappointment.
Dr. Donald Worcester, editor of the Hispanic American Historical Review.
During the Latin American Wars of Independence, the Latin Americans anticipated and hoped for substantial aid from the United States, but no official aid was forthcoming. It's true that men like Henry Clay spoke strongly in favor of assisting Latin America, and statues of him have appeared in various of the Latin American countries, but the United States was not in a position to help anyone militarily or economically. Basically, this was an attempt to guarantee the security of the United States and nothing more. It was a unilateral doctrine, as is the case with most of the major aspects of any nation's foreign policy. Later on, later presidents interpreted the Monroe Doctrine in manners to make it possible for them to carry out policies which may not have affected directly Western Hemisphere security.
One of those later presidents with a new interpretation for the Monroe Doctrine was Theodore Roosevelt. His Roosevelt Corollary ushered in an age of protective imperialism and dollar diplomacy.
One of the things that we insisted on at that time was pretty much the sanctity of American investments.
Professor of Latin American Economics at the University of Florida, Robert Bradbury, explains the meaning of the Roosevelt Corollary.
And one of the modifications of the Monroe Doctrine was the Roosevelt Corollary, that if we said under the Monroe Doctrine that a European nation could not intervene in Latin American affairs, we were morally responsible to be the collecting agency for bad debts where a Latin American nation refused to pay. This led in the 20th century to our sending Marines into Central American republics and into Haiti and Santo Domingo in order to collect debts. Also, this increase in our economic interest in Latin America, and as a result of the war with Spain, our acquisition of territories overseas, caused us to be interested in the construction of the Panama Canal.
The Panama Canal episode is unanimously agreed upon in both North and South America as one of the truly black pages in American history. There is no doubt that the United States intervened in the Panamanian revolt against Colombia, that we prevented Colombian troops from landing there. Dr. Worcester comments on Theodore Roosevelt's role.
Hasty Teddy said that it was his policy to speak softly or walk softly and carry a big stick. And this sounded amusing at first, but after the Panama affair, it was no longer amusing. The treaty we signed with Panama after Panamanian independence was probably the most rapid action of this sort ever taken by the United States. And this is one of the things which caused some eyebrows to be raised with regard to our part in the whole affair.
Even as late as December 1960, a noted Latin American advocate of democracy, Jose Figueres, could berate an American audience for embracing dictators.
The United States have had too much complacency, too much connivance with regimes that were hated with the people. And the United States has overlooked Latin America in this terrible attitude of not knowing what is going on, of not making any distinction between a democratic movement and a dictatorial one, in not knowing who the leaders were, in not knowing what's going on, who wants honest reform, honest and democratic social movement, and who is what.
I think that the purpose of the United States in doing this, that is maintaining dictators, is to keep Latin America from communism.
Mario Ariet, a Cuban exile attending the University of Florida. His is typical of student opinion throughout Latin America.
But I would say that just creates resentments on the part of the Latin American countries. I could cite, for instance, the example of Nicaragua, where the sons of a former dictator, Somoza, are now dictators of the country. This former dictator, Somoza, was set in power by the United States. And they live in a hill, which it's on top of the city of Managua, the capital of Nicaragua. And this hill is all surrounded by tanks and military force. And the only other building besides the residence of the Somozas is the United States Embassy, which is inside that military fence they have. So that creates an identification between the dictators, which are hated by the people, and the United States. And naturally, when those dictators are overthrown, then the natural reaction of the people is against the United States and toward the only other leading country in the world, namely Russia or communism.